Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast for January 27th, 2022. I'm Mark Hillary here in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
Hi, everybody. I'm Peter Ryan here in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Mark, can you believe we're almost 1/12 of the year done?
Yeah, I know it's difficult. I know just before we came on air, I was talking to you about this and how January's been such a strange month because it seemed like, I think as a result of COVID, everybody took a much longer Christmas and New Year break than you might normally expect. I was sitting at my desk on January 3rd, ready, and nobody was answering the phone, nobody was answering emails, and it took at least another week before everybody came back.
You're right. And now it seems everybody has come back and back with a vengeance. I agree. January is always a peculiar month when we're getting back into our post-Christmas work period. And in Montreal, it's especially peculiar when you see the mercury dip down to the minus 35, minus 40 point, which we've seen far too many times so far in 2022. But as I say, it can only get better, to quote that Dream song. And the Dream reference is really important, Mark, because we're talking with a former collaborator, a former member of Dream today, Mr. William Carson, who is the Director of Market Engagement at Ascensos, who's based in London.
For me, it always goes back to when Next Directory came out in 1988, shortly followed by First Direct in 1989. And I think it's really difficult for a 21st century native, and by that I mean someone born in 1995 onwards, to really understand what the wow factor was in 1988 when suddenly you could call Next Directory at 10 p.m. at night, up to 10 p.m. at night, and order clothes and get them delivered within 48 hours to your home. And by the way, if it didn't fit, you could ring them back and they'd send someone to pick them up.
And William is talking about the difficulty of predicting the future of CX and how his company, Ascensos, is handling the return to the office after COVID. And they've got quite a different approach that's quite different to most CX companies. And as you mentioned, William's a musician, and that's one of the things we are talking about in the interview, is this idea of people having a life outside the office and how can you help people to balance what they're doing. We've all heard about work-life balance for many years, but how do companies realistically now manage it?
Well, this is it. And I think what came out of the interview for me, something that I thought was really important, was the extent to which William was able to evangelize on the vision that Ascensos has for its team of agents, its team of supervisors, its individuals who form that CX ecosystem to actually have a real work-life balance, and the steps that they're taking to making sure that when they're at work is convenient for them, that they're able to go to locations that are going to be in an atmosphere that they will enjoy, being able to deliver the best possible CX. And to my mind, it's a very progressive approach we hear from a lot of companies, but Ascensos is really putting the rubber to the road here.
Yeah, I think they've really got an interesting story and it's a great interview. And we should announce that this is actually episode 200 of the CX Files. This podcast started in the middle of 2018. So we're at 200 episodes a bit earlier than you might expect, given that there's 52 weeks in a year. But that's because during the pandemic, we were doing daily updates. I mean, this podcast was going out every day with case studies focused on how people in CX were coping with such a sudden change. And I should mention that when I was asking for ideas for the name of the podcast in 2018, it was William who suggested CX Files. So that's why he's here with us to celebrate episode 200.
And 200 episodes is no small feat. I had the privilege of joining this podcast well into your weekly cadence, Mark, about a year and a half ago, and it's been quite a thrill. I have truly enjoyed the time that I've spent as a co-host of this podcast, but equally speaking, I think the thrill always comes listening to the amazing guests that you and myself have been able to recoup. And, you think about the 200 people that we have spoken to over the course of the past nearly 4 years now, and I'm truly marveling at the wisdom they've been able to impart. But what's equally, if not more exciting, is the lineup of people that we've got for future episodes, many of which are already in the can and just awaiting the play button.
Yeah, there's some really great episodes coming soon. And I think that what's interesting is that last year we had several like genuine sort of sponsorship inquiries, people really wanting to get behind this podcast. And although there was money on the table, we actually turned everybody down and said, do you know what's great about this is it's completely independent. We get anybody on here that we want to get on here, and it's just me and Peter, and that's it. There's no other decision making or needing to satisfy any sponsors. So I think that's a really great thing about this podcast.
Well, that's it. It all comes down to thought leadership. And as you were describing that, Mark, the fact that we had some very kind and very generous offers from individuals who wanted to potentially get involved with the podcast from a sponsorship perspective, it made me think of that epic movie Wayne's World back about 30 years ago, in which Wayne and Garth sold the rights to the TV show to a consortium run by Rob Lowe. And it didn't turn out as well as they hoped they would, but they eventually found their way back.
Yeah, Noah's Arcade, wasn't it? The first advert, I think.
Come bust a move at Noah's Arcade. That's right. With the epic, I think that was Brian Murray, Bill Murray's brother, who took that role on.
Oh yeah. Okay, well let's move away from Wayne's World and talk about what's actually happening in the world this week. Peter, have you seen anything in the CX news or LinkedIn, or what's been catching your attention this week?
Well, if I'm honest with you, I think it's been a slow news week, whether it's been on LinkedIn or otherwise, when it comes to CX-related stories. But I want to stick on the movie track for a second, Mark, specifically movies in the 1990s. I wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that last night I spent a couple of hours watching the masterpiece that is Grosse Pointe Blank. Now, our listeners may recall this film. It came out in the spring of 1997, making it 25 years old this year. And it stars John Cusack, Minnie Driver, Alan Arkin, Dan Aykroyd. And I bring this up because this was filmed at the time of the burgeoning of electronic communication, digital communication. And as I watched it last night, what struck me was the extent to which individuals, even 25 years ago in a movie set in Detroit, were not just picking up their landlines, not just communicating via the traditional telephone, but they were using cell phones more often than they were using anything else for voice communication. At one point, Dan Aykroyd is communicating with a client of his via text messaging. Not text messaging, web chat messaging. There's a couple of scenes in which we see email being used, referencing email, contact me via email for any queries that you might have. And I thought to myself, what a window, what a snapshot 25 years ago we had from a Hollywood movie that's rated the 28th best comedy of all time, I might add, by Empire Magazine. And we can see how far we've come. But at the same time, I ask myself, Mark, from a CX multi-channel perspective, have we really come that far if 25 years ago, lots of the channels we take for granted today were being used in their infancy back then?
Yeah, I think that looking back at films and the way that they show kind of customer interactions can be interesting. One that I always think of is Minority Report, it's now 20 years old, a Tom Cruise movie where the police could actually predict who's going to commit a crime, and then they can go and arrest you before you do it. And when you look at that movie now, it actually looks very dated. The idea of things like adverts being personalized to the individual. I mean, this is all stuff that we take completely for granted now. And yet the book, which it was a Philip K. Dick book from 1956. And when you read the book, I think because you're not actually looking at it visually and you're creating the world in your imagination, the book still looks far reaching and imaginative. But, that's just an interesting thing about things like how advertising has been seen through the ages.
Very true, very true. And I know that we're going off on a popular culture rant here when it comes to CX, and I won't even mention the book or the movie Ready Player One. That's another story for another day.
All right, we'll do that next week then, maybe. I just wanted to throw in a new survey that I saw, and that's the UK Customer Service Institute. And the interesting thing is just that the numbers of people complaining about products and services has actually jumped by 2% in the past year. So 13% of all customers are now complaining about the products they bought. And in the auto sector, that's over 14% now. And that's the highest ever level of complaints about car purchases. So I think that, interesting that we're seeing the highest ever level of complaints in the UK. But another interesting stat that came out of that research is that the level of customers prepared to actually pay money for better service is also at the highest ever, and that's 43.5%. And that's crazy. I mean, that's almost half of customers are prepared to put cash on the table if you can deliver a better service. And I think everyone listening to this should really take that into account and think about how does that affect their business.
I couldn't agree more. And to my mind, there is a real problem in terms of the disconnect between what consumers feel they deserve and what they expect versus what organizations, it doesn't matter the industry, are able to deliver. Let's be frank, Mark. I mean, I think it's endemic. There are some sectors where customers are never going to be satisfied. And I would probably dare say the travel industry, the airline industry, that would be top of the list. People are always also complaining about things like telecommunications. They're complaining about the, certainly when I visited the UK before Christmas time in November, people were very upset about the extent to which they were anticipating their energy bills were going to go up, but the service seemed to be going down. I'm not sure that providers, no matter what the sector, are really ready for the level of consumer anger, which is the topic we discussed last week on the pod. And they better be prepared. They've got to find a way of making sure people feel that they're getting value. And if you've got that number of respondents to a survey saying they're prepared to spend more in order to get better customer service, we're really at, I think, a point of inflection where there's going to be some type of a shakeout in many different industries. And big brand names that aren't able to deliver on the goods, no pun intended, are going to find themselves in a significant amount of commercial trouble.
All right, that's great. Thanks very much, Peter. Let's stop chatting before we turn this into a pop culture podcast and switch over to the interview with William Carson, who's talking about returning to the office and the future of CX. Okay, well, it's great to have you on the podcast. Now, this is actually episode 200, and we wanted to talk to you because back in 2018, when I floated the idea of starting this podcast, I was asking everybody online for names, and it was you that actually came up with CX Files. So to start with, thanks very much for the idea. Let's go back and just give a sort of introduction to yourself and how you personally ended up working in CX. So what was your journey?
Well, firstly, great to be on, Mark, and thanks for remembering me around the 200th episode. And also, congratulations to you guys for doing such a terrific job. Obviously, you for so many years on your own, and then now with Peter's input, I think it's a massive service to the industry. My own journey really goes all the way back, if I'm honest, thinking first and foremost, I am a customer. How brands engage with me and how I engage with them has always been massively important. And for me, it always goes back to when Next Directory came out in 1988, shortly followed by First Direct in 1989. And I think it's really difficult for a 21st century native, and by that I mean someone born in 1995 onwards, to really understand what the wow factor was in 1988 when suddenly you could call Next Directory at 10 p.m. at night, up to 10 p.m. at night, and order clothes and get them delivered within 48 hours to your home. And by the way, if it didn't fit, you could ring them back and they'd send someone to pick them up. Then a year later to have First Direct open, 24-hour, 365 banking. That's when you still had half day closing on Thursdays. Nothing was open on Sundays. And it was £1.20 a pint probably. And you used to be able to go into the pub and then ring First Direct from the payphone after you put your 10 pence in and listen for the pips to transfer money so you could go and buy a kebab on the way home at 11 p.m. at night. That stuff, now we think nothing of that. But actually nothing has happened that was so materially different to the customer experience as what happened between 1988 and 1989, both of which were things that I embraced totally at the time. My first job then was in Sitel Consulting, which, as it happened in 1999, was one of the organizations in its pre-acquisition form, Lieberman and Roncroni Group, L&R Group, that had been part of setting up First Direct Bank. Very much, and I still have the book here, I'm talking about it's a call center around which they've built a bank, not the other way around. Even that thinking back then was exciting. And I still think there's many, many brands that haven't got there yet with that thinking 34 years on.
Yeah, that's interesting because I was quite an early First Direct customer as well, from about 89 or 90 onwards. Yeah. And so when I look at banking today, it's funny because I still see that the branches that close early on Wednesdays and stuff. Here in Brazil, you still have that kind of stuff, and even the normal working day is only like 10 till 3 or something. Yeah. And yet for the whole of the 90s, I was doing telephone banking, and then in the late 90s, I went to Co-op because Co-op was one of the early adopters of online banking. And so, I've been banking on the internet since the 90s. So you're right that there's been organizations that have been looking at this a long time ago.
Yeah.
Let's look at a subject that you mentioned something to me about SMS and how there was so much research about the future of interacting with customers was SMS, and yet nobody sort of predicted that WhatsApp was going to completely replace SMS. So we've been looking at this CX journey for a long time now, but how can we possibly predict future trends when we can't even imagine these kind of interventions like WhatsApp suddenly coming into the market?
I think it's actually easy to predict the future if we stick to the simplicity of what a customer is trying to do is achieve a desired outcome. They won't think like that. They won't think in terms of customer journey. But as customers ourselves, we know what they're trying to achieve is an outcome. Then we simply have to look at technologies, platforms, mechanisms that are the path of least resistance for that customer to achieve that outcome. And WhatsApp is a great example. I used to do a lot of work in marketing back 20 years ago when Flytext came along with the first SMS campaigns, and it looked like it was heralding the future of SMS. And then we had RTC, Rich Text Communications, that was going to make SMS possibly book tickets and all the rest of it. Then they just got sideswiped by WhatsApp completely. And as you say, getting a text these days has become a meaningful thing again because it must be important because it's a text rather than, SMS spam. But I think if you look at WhatsApp as a channel, all it was doing was trying to deliver peer-to-peer communications as quick and as easily as possible. There were brands like Beauty Bay that were way ahead of the curve in how to use WhatsApp, but even they fell down because you would go on the Beauty Bay WhatsApp, but you still had to then press on a hyperlink to get into a WhatsApp store or online. There were other organizations like HomeTree, which really took it to the nth degree. I got a new boiler in London here 3 years ago. And what they did was, instead of sending an engineer to the apartment, they did the video with an engineer over WhatsApp video. So I wandered around the house showing them where the flue would be, where the site of the boiler would be. That took £1,000 off the next best quote, which they then guaranteed because they'd done their own WhatsApp video reconnaissance, as it were. So it was certainly a much more customer-centric aspect to the long journey of how customers can get accessing to your brand. But I think the big difference, Mark, was that when you saw that organizations got really disconnected between who owned bringing a new channel in, was it marketing, was it IT? Were there other internal political arguments going on between who had the ear of the CEO, who didn't? Were there other discussions like, actually, let's keep costs down, guys, because the owner of the company wants to sell it on to another capital venture business in a year's time. So we must keep it looking on paper like this. So no, we're not going to concentrate on where we're going to invest or could invest. So I think there's all these other elements that come into play when sometimes we're discussing why isn't it that brands can't predict or can't put into effect what are obviously clear winners for the experience for customers? So I think it's not difficult to predict, and we'll see more of this with IoT, the connected car, the tokenization of connected cars coming up in the next 3 to 5 years. But fundamentally, if we keep to that purism, where is the customer trying to go? What's the path of least resistance? Are there other ways of helping them get there? And I think if every brand did a monthly review of that mantra against what they're trying to do with customers, I think they'd be far quicker to cut in terms of new technologies.
Yeah, and on that subject of sort of looking to the future, one of the biggest issues in the BPO sector at the moment is this ongoing process of returning to the office. Some companies have been looking at a sort of return to 2019 standards. They're looking at a return to what they're calling normal. And others are saying, well, we're happy to ask our staff where they want to carry on working. And if they want to stay at home, then they can continue at home. Now, I know that Ascensos has announced the Ascensos Local initiative, and this is quite different to what most people are doing. So could you just explain how that's working and how it's going now?
Sure. So Ascensos Local was launched towards the end of the summer last year in Scotland. The idea came from the leadership of the business saying, look, work from home isn't all about technology solutions. There has to be a human aspect to it as well. And at the same time, with the launch of Ascensos Isle of Wight, that sort of planted the seed of this idea that you could go to underserved employment populations where perhaps they didn't have access to the global digital jobs that dominate, if you like, in some of the more forward-looking sectors. And that really planted the seed of where else could you go on a smaller basis with that served both the purpose of bringing digital jobs to environments that were underserved and perhaps economically distressed because, like our first Ascensos Local at Stranraer, that was a wonderful port for the Northern Ireland, Scotland line and others for many years before the port moved downstream to Cairnryan. So this town that had been built there with lots going on in it, great community, suddenly found itself a bit adrift. And by going in there with a small environment, a hub environment, 50 to 100 seats max, in the middle of the high street, in the middle of the community, still serving the major global clients that we have as partnerships, and still allowing people to work from home, but giving them that onboarding and training experience in a classic environment that they then can go away 5 miles wherever they might work within 5 miles radius. That we've found has been massively beneficial to us for accessing new labour pools. And by having several of these, and the plan is to have 6 of them up and running, 3 or 4 already on the cards and about to go live by the end of June, I think, end of Q2 next year. It's given us a real ability to slightly sidestep the talent shortage issue that many of the other organizations, not just in our industry, but other industries, are facing into at the moment.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting there is it's what a lot of people are talking about. A lot of analysts are saying there has to be something in between the warehouse hangar type contact center and the work from home. And it just seems that instead of talking about it, you've actually gone and done something.
Yeah, and I think it also serves that community aspect. We really do try and say, look, if we're going to operate in a community, there has to be something that we give back to the community. The idea is also that because the sites aren't ostensibly contact centers themselves, although they have the full functionality and operability to do that, and some clients like to use them from time to time in that way, they can also be made available to appropriate community groups who might want to come in. And then Ascensos becomes part of the community in a real sense, not simply as somebody who might be here until perhaps some investment round runs out from wherever it might be. This isn't that way for Ascensos Local. It's very much how can we be community focused to the benefit of the community and the people that we employ within that community.
Yeah, and this is also all about employee flexibility and offering people more flexibility in their personal life, as well as being able to blend their life with their job. And one angle here that you've talked to me about in the past is side hustles. And what do people do in addition to their regular day job? And I just remembered this because I think the most recent Harvard Business Review podcast was actually talking about this and saying companies should be encouraging or at least tolerating side hustles. So, what do you think then is the value in sort of encouraging employees to have something else on the go?
The value to a business like Ascensos is almost establishing a hive mindset based around the spirit of entrepreneurship. I think if you just say, there's your station, there's your role, we'll give you all the tools, we'll give you all the skills, but guess what? That person may be far more skilled in some other thing that's relevant to our clients, influencer marketing, vlogging, whatever it might be. And we're kind of putting a lid on that simply for, or we would be putting a lid on that if we didn't say, well, actually, we're going to be an environment where you can talk to us about your ideas. You can have some of the flexibilities that you might need. Now, yes, we're just at the beginning of that kind of looking at how that might work inside a business in a more structured way. But certainly at Ascensos, we are formed by an entrepreneurial spirit, entrepreneurial leadership. The idea that we can continue to evolve that inside the business is definitely going to be more relevant for us, that we remain meaningful and relevant to our clients and meaningful and relevant as employers to the people that want to work for us. But I think you're absolutely right. There's been some statistics out. I know Great Recruiter, Red Recruitment in the UK, has done a lot of work on this and gathering the stats from PwC and Deloitte. And it's something like 70% of Gen Z or millennials have something ongoing. And certainly that's exploded through the pandemic. And the idea that you would not look to that as a positive in your business as we face into the rest of the 21st century is a bit of a nonsense in my view. You've got to look at what the 21st century holds for all of us as a life balance, not a work-life balance, a life balance, whether that's remunerative aspect to your life or some other aspect to your life going forward, to really get benefit for how CX is going to progress supporting brands in the future.
Yeah, because this also made me think about gig CX, because one of the aspects of gig CX that seems to be attractive is that you can find people based on their interests and then get them involved in customer service. So if you know that somebody is a fashion blogger and you're a fast fashion brand, then why not get them on your CX team, even if it's just a few hours a week? So do you think that that's where maybe, the idea of flexibility that you've been talking about, it could even cross over with gig CX, and we're looking at maybe blended teams of like a core set of employees, but with some contractors, layered on top as well?
Well, I'm not going to preach to you, Mark Hillary, about Gig CX because you're on top of this area, but I absolutely agree with you that looking to the future, it's undoubtedly the way to go for many brands that have that forward-looking approach to where they go next to access the markets that are valuable to them. And I think to serve the customer care aspect within those markets, absolutely, Gig has got a part to play, but an important part, not just an add-on, bolt-on, a really important part to play. And of course, we've got the great examples that we've seen through Limitless, through the other providers that I've seen over the years. They're doing a great job in this area. And I think what's interesting, though, is it's a tech play much more than a people play in some regards, where they're very much putting the brand and the brand advocates together through a technology solution that actually facilitates the ease with which that can be achieved. And yeah, while it's not something that Ascensos is really focused on at the moment because we've got so many other models that are working well for us, it's certainly something we don't look at and say hasn't got a part to play in the wider industry, because it just makes complete sense to me that you would want an advocate of your brand. And I know from listening to some of the stories that where particularly you've got big global brands and you're using people that are already inside that brand in some way as a user are actually then serving customers who may become users. There's stickiness on both sides, greater engagement for the customer, greater loyalty from the customer, but also greater advocacy from someone that's maybe a power user of that brand or that platform that's reaching out to customers or in some way serving them. So I think without doubt, it's going to increase. It might consolidate, it might reach a plateau, but that will only be a plateau until some other technological aspect arrives and further perpetuates it again at speed.
Yeah, I'm sure that we can find a world famous guitar brand that might want you to be answering customer questions,
Yeah, absolutely. I just need to try all the guitars on a long-term loan basis.
Okay, I mean, just to close out then, we're still in the first part of the year. We're still in January. So what are you looking forward to in 2022? I mean, is there any particular plans that you've got or anything you're looking forward to?
Well, in a sense, also, I think we're really looking forward to expanding what we've already set out to achieve through setting up in South Africa or growth in Central Europe and also in Western Asia, where we've again expanded our operations in Turkey to 3 sites. Um, but at the same time, in the UK, we've just opened our Ascensos campus by taking on extra office space, which goes all the way back to one of your questions earlier. And of course, the importance about that is because as we look for the commercial flexibility to support client scope and scale across these nearshore and offshore regions. It also frees up a lot of talent to look at the more proactive sales engagement that's achievable now that we have seen great examples of it with clients of our own through assisted sales and clienteling, as it's called, where we're going in appropriately within the customer journey through live chat to actually engage with customers where they're getting stuck, perhaps not adding to a basket that actually is clear that there's some items that they it could be curated. And I think that curation has often been overlooked as customers don't mind being engaged as long as it's not something that's selling them something that's inappropriate. A curated customer experience, absolutely fine with it. And then, and more widely, I'm looking forward to seeing how brands like Vinted go up against Depop, and seeing how that pop-up mentality that's taking over in retail at the moment, certainly seeing it in places in London, is going to actually look now. There's a one of them is an organization 202 Street, working out of a salon on Berwick Street in Soho. A young woman, Maya Nicol, and what they're doing is very much at the heart of the kind of wider global Vinted model, but they're already having huge success. They featured in Vogue Business just this week. And I think those are the things that are going to excite me to see them take off and actually then see the big players have to react. And then, of course, from our perspective as a sense, also will be how we continue to support some of those as they become essentially new economy brands.
All right, that's great. And I think you're definitely right there that the circular economy is going to be big this year.
Yeah, there's no escaping sustainable, economic, all those good things that are becoming hallmarks of your choices of whether to engage with a brand or not as a customer.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favourite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.